Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. That was Thomas Jefferson. We have not left it to Thomas Jefferson to decide that question. Instead, technology and our own fickle behavior as consumers are doing it for him. The news business is changing. Computing in all of its forms is at least partially responsible. And tonight, we begin a series within our Revolutionaries programming to consider the future of news and the implications for us all, because as Jefferson outlined, the implications can be quite stark. How appropriate to begin that examination here at KQED in San Francisco with two public broadcasting leaders who are doing so much to shape that future and to imagine news as a growing and ever more important service of nonprofit public media. KQED under President and CEO Jarl Boland is becoming a regional powerhouse of news and information. It is reimagining its service, not just here, but across the world, as an information source on all devices. NPR, under its new president and CEO, Jarl Mohn, is doubling down on its own news commitment, both nationally and internationally, and recently announced the hiring of a veteran and respected Associated Press executive to head its news division. Both John and Jarl themselves have journalism backgrounds. They both have very distinguished credentials in the field, and together they are leading their institutions to new partnerships and new approaches to news and information. One of the most important partnerships they have formed and continue to form is one between NPR and KQED themselves. Please join me in welcoming Jarl Mohn and Jarl Boland.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. John, it seems weird to be welcoming you in your own studio, but welcome nonetheless.
I'm not often on stage here, so.
We're delighted to have you here as well, Jarl. So
thank you.
Let's dive right in to the modern practice of the journalism that Thomas Jefferson envisioned almost 3 centuries ago. Let's consider that quote about a world with newspapers and no government, or vice versa. What do you think that means to us today as consumers, and especially to you as producers of news and information?
Well, journalism, fact-based journalism, has never been more important than it is right now. And so I think that although he was talking about newspapers, we can interpret it more broadly to talk about journalism. I think it's true. The caveat, or the qualification I put on it, is in today's world there are so many sources. Not all of it, most of it in fact, is not fact-based. A lot of it is ideological, a lot of it is speculative, a lot of it is opinion. It's interesting, it's entertaining, but in a lot of cases it is not news.
John, how about you?
Well, I don't think that Thomas Jefferson meant that literally, because of course it would be rather chaotic not to have a government and just have news media. But I think the point he was trying to make was that a democracy doesn't function well without an informed citizenry, without people having news and information, because if it's going to be government by the people, then the people have to hold the government accountable, and they need to have the information. And I don't think that's changed. I agree with Jarl. I think it's more important than ever that people be well informed and make well-informed decisions based on facts. And I just don't think that changes. However, I would say that we need both government and news media.
We'll come back to that philosophy, and especially the way digital technology is influencing what you've just said. But let's back up for just a moment, because I think there are a lot of people who may not fully understand how NPR and KQED work, how public radio works in general, or even public television. So can you talk a bit about how they work together and what makes them the same, what makes them different? Jarl, how about you?
Sure. Well, it's a great relationship for us, hopefully for John and his team. And we think for our listeners and the people that use the content that we produce, it's a great blending of what we do, which is international and national news. We have 17 bureaus in the United States. We have 17 bureaus internationally. And that's great. But what really makes it work is combining that with the regional and local coverage that a member station like KQED provides. The two services together really make the whole. Alone, pretty good. Together, really strong.
Yeah, and actually it's a long time partnership. KQED was founded in 1954 as an educational television station, which we still are, but we added the radio station in 1969, and what most people don't know is that PBS and NPR were founded in 1970. So we had been around for 16 years waiting for PBS and NPR. KQED was a founding member of both organizations, and particularly close to NPR, because what most people don't know is that in 1970, when NPR was created, Bernard Mays, who was the general manager of KQED Public Radio at the time, was the first chair of the board of NPR and signed the founding documents of NPR. And then at that time, KQED Public Radio did classical music combined with NPR News. And then in 1987, became the first FM station in the country to go all news and information, sort of all NPR. And we've been joined at the hip ever since with a very successful service for the community.
John, I want to stay with you for a minute and dive a little deeper now into what's happening in news here at KQED and all the different ways that you both think of reporting it and think of distributing it. You've made a major commitment to news and especially regional news. And I'd like for you to talk a bit about why you did that and how it's actually beginning to take shape.
Well, it's very much driven by the needs of the community. One of the things that we constantly remind ourselves at KQED is that the only reason this institution exists is to serve the people of the Bay Area. And what's become very apparent over the last decade, at least, and very intensely in the last 5 years since, if you think about it, 5 years ago, most people did not have a smartphone in their pocket, and now most people do. So there are dramatic changes in what people need from us, which has resulted in us making pretty big changes at KQED. What people need is evolved in two ways. One of them has to do with technology and all of the different ways in which people are receiving content from KQED and NPR and consuming it and interacting with us and interacting with each other. And so one of our goals is to be as good at social and mobile and internet media as we are at television and radio. And that's a work in progress, that's something that we're paying attention to every day. But the other part that's been actually a more dramatic impact on KQED is the dearth of coverage on the regional level, the void that's been created because, again, of digital. But this is really the digital disruption of the traditional commercial advertising supported media model that really has sustained our newspapers for more than 100 years and sustained our commercial radio and television since their founding. That's really broken. And I think everybody in any community around the country knows that their local newspapers have drastically cut back coverage because they simply do not have the revenue to provide it any longer. That's been a real call to action for KQED. We feel that it's our responsibility to fill that void. And so while coverage of the Bay Area has always been part of what we do, I think we were doing it very much in partnership with the newspapers and other media. And we were covering what they weren't. And also, I think, taking the traditional public media approach, which is more than the headlines. Really the story behind the story, the context, the reasons, the why, as well as the what. But we're doing that in a much broader way, and we've made changes in basically two areas as well. One, in order to really be multi-platform, and we're very fortunate to have a multimedia organization with all these platforms under one roof, we've taken all of our editorial people and formed them into multimedia units, meaning that in the news unit, for example, there are people who do video and people who do audio and blogs and photos and interactives and games and educational public affairs material for use by teachers. And the same is true in our arts and science units. And the goal is to become what we call platform agnostic. In other words, not just devoted to doing radio or TV or a blog, but being able to deliver a story in whatever way works best and over whatever platform works best. And then the other change is really just doing more. In order to fill that void, we've more than doubled our editorial staff in the last 5 years. We now have a newsroom with over 160 journalists and producers and editors. We've increased our newscasts on radio threefold. We've launched kqednews.org. We've launched the Newsfix blog. We've beefed up our coverage and our staff in Sacramento to cover the state government and expanded our operation in San Jose to cover Silicon Valley. So it's just a time of incredible change and growth.
160 in your newsroom. How does that compare to any other news organization we might think of, much less one that's a public nonprofit institution?
Well, interestingly, it's still not as big as the San Jose Mercury News or the Chronicle were before the decline. And I don't have the exact numbers, but the cutbacks have been as much as 70%. And we now have a larger newsroom than the two metro newspapers do. But it still is not up to the level of the coverage that newspapers provided at one time, and we're probably still going to grow beyond that. I should say that when we say newsroom, we mean it in the broad sense that it includes people who do news, but also people who do arts and science and environmental coverage and health coverage. It's basically our editorial operation, but it's at least twice as large as it used to be.
Now, Jarl, you came in and stated very clearly and very early on, we're going to be about news. In fact, if I don't want to misquote you, but I think you even said something like, we talk a lot about content, I'm going to talk about news.
Yep.
Why have you felt so strongly about that as the new CEO?
Because it really is the backbone of who we are, and it is the primary reason that people come to us at NPR and come to our member stations. As John was explaining about this incredible franchise and this incredible service that he's built here in Northern California. We do a lot of other things. We don't just do news, and we do a lot of other really interesting things. But if we don't get the news part of it right, the other stuff doesn't matter. And that's why we're maniacally focused on doing that and being as good as we can be as journalists, as news people, not just covering the stories, not just doing the facts, providing context, explaining what's going on in the world, and hopefully doing it with great production and with great storytelling, because we think that's part of the magic of what public radio is, great storytelling.
Mm. Talk a little bit about the new executive that you've just hired to head your news effort.
We hired a great guy. His name is Mike Oreskes. He senior managing editor at the Associated Press. Been there for many years. He was at the New York Times for 20-some years. He was executive editor of the International Herald Tribune in Paris. He is a journalist's journalist and will bring even more rigor to the newsroom. He's been widely well received by the journalists, and you know journalists are a skeptical lot, kind of hard to please, but universally well received in our newsroom. He hasn't officially started yet. He starts on the 27th, but we think in terms of our mandate of doing great fact-based journalism, he's going to be a great addition. In addition to that, to what John is talking about, John and KQED have been real pioneers in public broadcasting and public radio in terms of making a commitment locally and regionally to news. It's happening across the country in more and more cities. And what Mike has done at the Associated Press, I think he had something like 1,000 reporters across the country domestically at the AP. And what we want to do is be a better partner with all of the member stations across the country and be a resource so that we can feed them national and international news. They can feed us local and regional news. The stations can talk to each other, and we'll have the network effect if we do that properly. And that's one of the reasons I hired Mike.
I want to talk about one other aspect that's important to both of you, which is being public and nonprofit. Bill Moyer said years ago that the wonderful thing about the digital economy is that every news organization is going to be nonprofit very soon. You sort of alluded to that, John.
We're ahead of the curve.
You were ahead of the curve, and now the whole world is catching up to you. So there's a financial imperative that bears down on you just the same way that it does for everyone else, and there's also a philosophical imperative. Let's talk about the financial imperative first, because you're both making huge investments in this very strategic bet that we want more news and we want it to be from organizations like yours. How can you afford to do that? Neither of you is leaping to take that question, so let me...
I can tell you, someone else gave me their opinion about why we can afford to do that. About 5 years ago, a venture capitalist on Sand Hill Road, who's an expert in media and also a fan of public media, at the end of a meeting said to me, the one thing you need to remember is your business model's not broken. And we aren't actually impacted in the same way that newspapers and commercial media are. Newspapers are where I spent the first half of my career. And the fact is that newspapers are supported by more than 90% by advertising. Public media, when I first came to public media, seemed sort of like a humorous model to a lot of my old friends back in the commercial media world, because they would say, so let me get this right. You create all this wonderful, intelligent, very high quality content on television and radio, and you give it away free to everyone. And then you ask them to voluntarily send you money. That sounds crazy. But it doesn't sound so crazy anymore. Because what's happened with digital is that the advertising model has been broken simply because you can't generate enough revenue with digital advertising to support the news operations that you supported with print advertising, for example. Whereas our business model's not broken because, as we do on radio and television, on digital, on a smartphone, on a tablet, online, on social media, we can still distribute wonderful, high-quality content for free to everyone, and we can ask them to voluntarily support it. And the real trick of this, and I think what we're experimenting with a lot, and some of the experimentation is in partnership with NPR, is how do you do that? Both how do you use those platforms in a way that you're using the right platform and the right format for the story to effectively deliver it, and then how do you ask for support? It's probably not a pledge drive on your smartphone, but it is other techniques, because the fact is that people do want to support public media. I call it giving people an opportunity to support us because they appreciate what we provide. And so a lot of our effort is going into how you do that and experimenting with that while we still have fairly robust support on television and radio. And so at the same time that our colleagues in other media sadly are cutting back, you pointed out that we're growing, and the way that we're growing is that the community is supporting us. So as we do more Bay Area coverage, our audience grows and our support grows. And a lot of that growth is coming on digital, obviously. But we've had 4 record years in a row in terms of support from the community. So we feel like we're on the right track, and that people do want KQED to step in and provide more regional coverage. But hopefully, that venture capitalist was right, and our business model will transition to digital in a much smoother way than our commercial media colleagues.
Now, Jarl, you've got both commercial and public media in your background. How do you see this, and especially how does it affect NPR?
Well, I agree with what John says. The thing that I think gives us a leg up in public media we have a number of sources of income. It's not just, in commercial media you have an advertiser model. We have corporate underwriting, or we have corporations that are very interested in reaching this amazing audience that public radio, public media has. Well-informed, very curious, very engaged in their community. Perfect for most organizations or brands to want to reach out and touch. So we have that. We have the individual donations that come to the member stations to support the kind of quality programming that KQED and other member stations do. Also institutions, foundations, who have specific missions and want to support journalism because they believe that an informed citizenry is a really good thing for the country. So we have a number of sources of income and revenue that commercial outlets don't necessarily have. And I think the competitive advantage we have is that as newspapers have become challenged, a lot of other commercial media, local television, network television, in an attempt to get ratings, have really kind of become a bit sensational in some cases. In some cases are doing shorter stories, more lifestyle stories, which is fine, and I do think there is an audience for that. It's just not our audience. And it creates an opportunity for us to do longer pieces, more thoughtful pieces, explanatory journalism. We're not for everybody. But the good news is there are enough people that are informed, intelligent, curious, that want to listen and want to support us.
Are you watching experiments like Pierre Omidyar's First Look Media, BuzzFeed, Politico, a lot of hybrid models that are certainly in the zone of what you're doing in news and public affairs in particular? They're not duplicating it, but it's a different model. It's a different reporting model, a different economic model. And what do you think about these new platforms that are starting to emerge?
Well, a lot of these people that you're referring to are doing it for very noble reasons. They want to have an impact. I think in the case of Pierre Omidyar, allocating, $250 million for First Look? We could have a lot more impact at public radio if he gave that money to us. Don't you think?
I agree.
And, Jeff Bezos, I think with $250 million for the Washington Post, in a very challenged industry, he wants to have an impact. I would never bet against that guy. He is a bright man, and I think he probably has a very interesting plan there. We could have an immediate impact tomorrow with that $250 million with us at NPR and with our member stations. And there are a number of other initiatives out there. We have to do a better job telling the story because we're reaching, on NPR every week, just about 30 million people every 7 days with our content. That's just over terrestrial broadcast radio. Online, npr.org, 32.5 million uniques every month. And in podcasting, last month, 70 million downloads of podcasts. So we're touching a lot of people. So I think their money could be better spent.
You hope he's listening?
Yeah, please. Send your dollars in today.
John, how about your view of that?
Well, I think all the experiments are interesting, and I think we're watching all of them because everyone's sharing what they've learned. I don't think any of the initiatives you mentioned or any others that I can think of, though, are really trying to do what we do. In other words, attempts to duplicate, and most of them are commercial. In other words, very few of those are nonprofits. I think ProPublica, Center for Investigative...
Well, they're all nonprofits right now.
Right, but not intentional.
Right.
I think that none of them are really attempting to do what public media does because it has been proven over and over again that it's not commercially viable. And so they're very much, as opposed to public media, which I would say, another thing Bill Moyers said once was, we're the only media that serve the public as citizens, not consumers. We're not trying to sell anybody anything. I don't think others are actually trying to emulate that model, because they are, in fact, hopefully will be profitable companies sometime and will return, value to their shareholders, and will aggregate eyeballs for their advertisers, because that's really their business model. I haven't seen anyone who's made a real attempt to either, one, duplicate the public media approach, or even duplicate our business model successfully, because that's really hard to do from a standing start. It's very hard to start a new online-only venture that does not have the benefit of a brand that's been around for 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years, and has existing audience, and has existing media platforms, and has an existing model where people are accustomed to the fact that you need to support this if you want to see it continue. That's hard to just turn around and say, oh, we're gonna become nonprofit now. Send us money. That doesn't work that well for commercial media. So I think it's all interesting experiments, but none of them are quite precisely what we're doing.
I actually want to pick up on that as the last question, as we're talking about the pursuit of journalism, both in broadcasting and digitally, before we turn to digital technology. And it's the rise of the sort of digital citizen journalist. The barrier to entry now to do that online is incredibly low. And we've seen individuals make an impact over the last 20 years. The Monica Lewinsky scandal was broken in part online. What do you think about that? Is there a fit with anything that you do? Is it a competitor? Is it irrelevant? Is there a sort of sensibility about this digital citizen journalism movement that has an effect on what you do at all?
To me, it seems almost like an antenna that's out there for being sensitive, or having one's antenna up in all sorts of areas and aspects of our society and culture and politics. But no one of these individual sources becomes a go-to place over any length of time to be a source of information. Interesting stories bubble up. A lot of news organizations run with these stories because they're sensational or they're interesting. But the really good journalistic organizations double check. They get verification on the stories. So I think this citizen journalism that you talk about is probably a great way to surface stories, but that's only the beginning. You have to have people really do research. True journalism has not changed, whether it's digital, whether it's television, whether it's radio, whether it's newspaper, whether it's online, whether it's mobile. It requires the same thing. It is not scalable. You have to do fact checking, you have to check sources, check quotes, edit, produce it well. There's a lot. It may be, the manufacturing of it and the distribution of it may be different, but the actual creation of it, really good storytelling, has not changed.
And I would agree. I don't even use the term citizen journalist. I think if there are independent journalists like you're talking about who create their own blog and have their own online audience, that seems similar to me to a columnist that's syndicated in the newspaper days, or even back to Thomas Jefferson, a pamphleteer could be an independent journalist. But we work with people in the community now much more around our journalism, and I would call it more audience engagement than citizen journalism, in that people in the community, because we now use digital media and it's two-way and you're communicating back and forth, and anyone could use their phone to capture audio or video or take a photo or type up a story and send it to us. So I think citizens can be sources, to Jarl's point. They can provide content, they can provide information, they can provide tips. But all of that, if you're Kqed or you're NPR, your brand stands for something, and people really trust you, and they trust that you've checked it out, that you're not simply unfiltered citizen journalism, if you will. But the other ways that we work with the audience, and I think the audience now in the 21st century with this kind of media wants to be part of the process. And there are ways for them to be part of the process other than actually doing the reporting. One is telling us what they're interested in. So we have an experiment starting soon at KQED called Bay Curious. And it's a program where we will ask people in the audience, what is it you want to know? What story do you think should be covered? What issue do you think we should take a deep dive on? We then do the story, and work with that audience member to determine, is this what you expected? Is this the content that you're looking for? And actually incorporate them into the story. So there's things like that. And then also we are much more now of a commons or a community forum than we ever were. I mean, KQED's been doing that for a long time. Of course, Forum with Michael Krasny's been on over 20 years. So we've had interactive media for a while, Michael reminds me. And we've had Perspectives on the radio for a long time, a very popular feature of citizens, really expressing their opinion and their point of view. But now with the ability to comment and have a dialogue on anything we produce, because everything that we produce on radio and TV is also available online, along with all of the online original content. And around any one of those stories, citizens can have a dialogue and have a conversation and comment, and they often end up the story changing based on what we hear.
I was going to ask you if it influences, or you can see it influencing
because
your
if somebody
editorial
brings
direction.
new information to the table, our journalists can make a judgment about the validity of the information, and then we should go and supplement the story with that. So I think the audience is, the people formerly known as the audience, we often say, are now very much part of the process, but not in doing the actual journalism, I don't think.
So your all stations are a great test tube for this kind of experimentation. Can NPR do that as well? I mean, you've got a big mandate to serve a lot of stations who have a lot of different needs. Do you foresee that kind of experimentation happening more and more?
I think we're going to be experimenting with a lot of things. We're starting a storytelling lab, which is to provide a platform for our writers, our reporters, our producers, anyone involved in the creative process to experiment with ideas, because that's where really the great ideas come from. Not just replicating or trying to reproduce the last big success. So we're trying to find a way to fund it, to make it work. We also, a lot of things that happen on air, on NPR, might have started out just as a short segment. And, much like The Simpsons did, was it the Tracy Ullman show, it then became a series. We've had a number of things that have come out of our programming that have gone on to become podcasts or regularly scheduled weekly programs. We want to continue to fund things like that. And it's a great creative outlet for our folks.
I'm going to talk a little more deeply now about digital. Let me ask you a question. When do you remember first being aware, I mean really aware, that something like the internet and that kind of technology was going to fundamentally change your view as broadcasting professionals, as journalists, as whatever at that moment made you say, wow, this is going to be different? Do you remember?
I vaguely remember, I think. I can't say that it was an actual moment or a turning point, but in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, as we were approaching digital conversion, and we're not talking about digital media, interactive media at this point, but rather KQED's television and radio operations converted from analog to digital, and we had to change cameras and everything else in the early 2000s in order to meet the federal mandate to be converted by a certain point in time. And I remember thinking at the time, because KQED.org was established in 1995, that we were kind of taking this step that was almost surpassed already by the interactive digital media that was coming. And so I remember thinking, we're putting all this investment into going digital with television and radio, and will there be television and radio in 10 years? Because you remember, if you worked anywhere around Silicon Valley, and obviously we're right in the middle of things here, In 2000, people were telling me there would be no television by 2010.
That was a serious question.
Yeah. Now, of course, television is still here, and so is radio. But at that time, I remember us making the investment and thinking, wow, this is just the beginning of enormous changes to come.
For me, there were three different points. One, and you might be very interested in this first one, with being the Computer History Museum. When I got my K-Pro computer in 1981, and I can give you a hell of a deal on it. If
We
you're
may
interested.
have it already. I don't know.
But I said, this is really different. And it was a luggable. It was 25 pounds. It was like this massive suitcase I used to pack up every day and take home. And I said, boy, this is going to change things. So that was point one. Point two, and I don't remember if it was in this particular order, but broadcast.com, Mark Cuban's company, which he then sold, listening to radio stations, or I think his primary reason for creating it was to hear sports broadcasts from across the country. I said, boy, this is going to really fundamentally change that. It could. And the third one was pirating music with Napster or LimeWire, any of the other music digital pirated services. I said, this is really going to provide some incredible challenges to any media, because if you can do it with music, you can do it with TV. If you can do it with TV, you can do it with film. And so those were the 3 points that were kind of eye-opening for me.
Is there tension at all in your organizations between your DNA being rooted in broadcasting and the advent of these new digital ways, both to report and to distribute and to reach your audience?
There definitely was tension.
You speak in the past tense.
And has been tension. I feel that the tension has evolved into synergy. And I'm hoping we continue on that path. I think the structural changes that we've made have helped, and time has helped. We've been, as I said, Kqed.org was established in 1995. That was 20 years ago. Yeah. So we've had 20 years to get used to this change and to really become a multimedia organization. And I think what's helped to overcome some of that tension and fear is that I think everyone at Kqed is very committed to serving the community. And as these 20 years have gone by, it's become increasingly obvious that if we're going to do that well, we're going to have to work together across media. And if Kqed is going to really operate, at a high level, we can't have silos. And so I think people have come to that conclusion, and as you pointed out, John, in recent years, we've made structural changes so that we don't think that way anymore. We don't think about this is TV and this is radio. This is a story, and a story is still a story. And what medium would be best suited for delivering that story to the audience, and how would you best present it across that platform? And some stories run on all platforms, and others don't. But I think we really try to take that multimedia, or what people call a platform agnostic approach. And I think we're getting there. I think there's probably still concerns, but I also think that what I think has been helpful is nothing's gone away. In a world where I was convinced by our colleagues in the Valley at the tech companies that both television and radio were going away 10 years ago, 15 years ago even. But what I think has happened is it's just been more. And while, of course, traditional television viewing has eroded, and in our case, radio viewing is stable, but has certainly eroded in music radio, it still exists. And what I see, even in looking at millennials, and we talk about millennials a lot, they're omnivores. Of course, they're much more tied to digital media, much more tied to a smartphone or a tablet or a laptop. But they get in a car and turn on the radio. and they occasionally turn on the TV and just see what's on, and that's very traditional viewing. And I think all of us are the same. We're all using all kinds of media all the time, and I think that fact that for example, radio hasn't been replaced reduces the tension. We're all still here, all the platforms are still here, people are still using all of these media.
I want to talk, Jarl, go ahead, you were about to answer that.
I was going to say, this is a really important one at our shop.
Yeah.
There is still tension. You know, we talk about this tension, we still have a lot of it, and I think it comes from this notion that there are always winners and there are losers. So it's going to be, traditional media is going to lose and new media is going to win. But I agree with what John is saying. Consumers, not just millennials, all consumers are omnivores. They're using everything. They'll read magazines, they'll watch television, they'll do over-the-top television, they'll use a DVR, they'll listen to terrestrial radio, they'll download a podcast, they'll go online, they'll use a cell phone, a smartphone, to stream something or to read some text. So it doesn't necessarily have to be winners or losers as it relates to radio. One of the interesting facts about millennials that people don't know is that last week, in the last 7 days, 90% of millennials listened to traditional FM broadcast radio, over the radio, not streamed. And they listened to digital media, and they were listening to Pandora and to Spotify, and they were doing all sorts of things. So we do have a bit of tension. It's because people like to frame things as this is winning and this is losing, and it's not the case. I think radio has been around for a long time. It will continue to be around for a long time alongside digital media. A lot of people thought television was going to completely put radio out. Radio changed. Mm-hmm. It's going to be around. It's a very inexpensive, efficient way of reaching a large community. I was talking to Jeff Simolian of MS Broadcasting the other day. He told me a really interesting thing. His radio station in New York, Hot 97, is the most streamed radio station in the United States. It's an urban contemporary FM radio station, very successful, in the largest market in the United States. #1 streamed on TuneIn. It costs him $410,000. He loses $410,000 a year on that. The most successful streamed radio station in the country. His FM radio station in New York, to reach the metropolitan area, what is it, 14, 15 million people? That FM transmitter costs him $39,000 a year to reach every single human being in New York that wants to listen to that station. The economics are pretty good.
How do you go get that new audience? And I'm thinking about in particular with news and factual programming. Are you having to devise new strategies to go after this millennial audience? I mean, that's a very broad characterization, or any audience. Well, I'm thinking about that audience in particular because the conventional wisdom about that group is that they're not big news listeners. They're not big consumers of factual programming. First, is that the wrong way to think about it? And second, how do you go?
I think it is the wrong way to think about it. I think it has been a mythology for a long time. They love stories. And the thing that's given me the most confidence about that point of view now is podcasting. When you look at the incredible success of podcasting, and I think the way podcasts sound today are going to be very instructive and directional about the way public radio sounds moving forward. It's more informal. It's still very fact-based. It's still very, in many cases, great journalism. And young people are listening to it, whether it's one of our podcasts, whether it's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me or Invisibilia, or whether it's This American Life or Serial, which was a runaway hit. People are, I think the mythology was if you want young people to listen, the story has to be short, it has to be fast-paced, it must be contemporary, it must be flashy. And podcasting has proven to us over and over and over again, it's none of those things. It's great storytelling.
I think we learned actually that we may binge watch House of Cards, but we'll also binge listen to Serial. That was that was a massive hit on that same scale.
Yep.
John, you were going to...
But also, I think we can't talk about millennials as this sort of monolithic
Right.
Group. If you look at KQED's situation, nearly 1 out of every 2 people in the Bay Area uses a KQED service every week. They either watch TV or listen to the radio or go online or use an app or maybe do multiple things. So that's wonderful. But that means that half the people in the Bay Area don't use a KQED service at all each week. And so the point is, it's not for everyone. And so all millennials are not the same. And all millennials do not have the same tastes or interests, and that's true of the general population. Public media does not reach everyone in the United States. We're available for free to everyone, but not everyone takes advantage and uses it. So I think the same would be true of millennials. So there are probably millennials who won't listen to a podcast or who do want a short sensational story. But just as with any other generation, there are millennials who are what I would call public media inclined. Meaning they're engaged in their community, they're interested in what's going on, they're voting, they're volunteering, and they're the classic public media audience member. And I think we're reaching them and we're serving them. I think they're listening to KQED Public Radio and NPR, but not every millennial is, just the ones who are interested in what public media has to offer.
And almost every consumer, whether it's a millennial, whether it's a baby boomer, are very broad in their tastes and listen to and consume media, not just different media platforms, but different media content. Mm-hmm. I have 2 adult daughters. They're both millennials. They both love really trashy reality television. And they like Radiolab and This American Life. And they listen to NPR. They do both. They'll check out the Kardashians, and then they'll listen to Morning Edition. Why not? Why do you, as consumers, we're not one-dimensional.
I'm going to ask one more question along this line about digital and journalism, and then we're going to go to some audience questions. I want to talk for a minute about growing journalism talent. What's it like now? What are you seeing when you see young journalists who want to come to work for your organizations in this new world where it's multi-platform and storytelling can come from anywhere and lead anywhere? What's that like for you?
I think there's a lot of enthusiasm. So it's anecdotal, but I'm seeing more interest in journalism than I've seen in a long time. And I understand that journalism schools are pretty overwhelmed with the number of students who are interested. We work with the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, the Stanford Graduate School of Journalism, San Francisco State's Journalism School, and thankfully, based on advice from NPR, I think our intern program has improved a lot. And the way in which we improved it, I went to NPR and met with their experts who do a wonderful job with their internships and with all of their human resources work, and asked what could we do to improve our internship program. And at the time, we were not paying the interns, which a lot of organizations, particularly nonprofits, do not. Rather, they would get credit. And what NPR advised was find a way to pay all of your interns. You will get greater diversity, you will have more options, you will have greater talent available to you. So we've done that, and it's really made a difference. I think what's interesting, though, is that even though people coming out of journalism school now are living in a world where digital media is ascending and is what they probably use more than traditional media, I find an awful lot of young journalists want to work in traditional media. In other words, someone comes out of journalism school, they know that the future is interactive digital media, but they want to be a news anchor. They want to be a radio newscaster. And I remember one time a story that we were involved in was being published in the New York Times, and it was about a development, an innovative development, and it involved the interactive team. And what was interesting was they wanted to know, was it just on NewYorkTimes.com or was it actually in the newspaper? and being in the newspaper was more valuable than being on NewYorkTimes.com. So it's that part of it's a little confusing. It's a little bit, you know, both sides, I guess.
That's a great story.
You know, John referred to the internship program. We've had a great internship program for a long time. We have a limited number of slots. An amazing, the demand for the opportunity to be an intern at NPR is pretty amazing. And we get some remarkable young people in through the doors that way. In addition to that, one of the things I'm involved with for a number of years is I was, right before I took the job at NPR, chairman of the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at USC. And again, as John said, a lot of interest in digital media, a lot of interest in radio journalism, a lot of interest in television. The new Annenberg building on the campus at USC has got an innovation lab, a digital lab, it's got all sorts of stuff. But guess what's downstairs right in front of glass windows for everybody to see, and the thing that generates the most interest? It's the television studio.
Let me go to some questions now. The first question, actually, John, is about this startup accelerator for new media companies that you're a part of, this accelerator called Matter. Talk a little bit about that, and the question actually is, why are you doing it, and what do you hope to get out of it?
Well, it's called Matter Ventures, and it's a startup accelerator that's housed in a garage south of Market, and former garage. And Kqed and the Knight Foundation were the founding investors in this accelerator back at the beginning of 2013. And the reason that we got involved in it was twofold. One, we wanted to be at the table, or have a place at the table, to see all of the new ideas and developments and products and services that were being developed by entrepreneurs that related to journalism. So Matter is definitely focused on supporting entrepreneurs who are creating media for good, for lack of a better word, and really who are operating at the intersection of entrepreneurial, you know, startup culture and public media. And we weren't sure at the time that we started it whether there would be a lot of companies who were operating at the intersection of public media values and entrepreneurship, but there are. We have hundreds of companies apply for each class. So we wanted to be there and learn, really, and encounter people who had great ideas. The second reason was we're here. We happen to be the public media organization that's in Silicon Valley, and we felt we wanted to be more part of the culture. And I think it's helped Kqed, because I think since Matter began, and it actually turns out that Matter is the only startup accelerator focused on media in the world right now. We're into our second fund and a new class of companies. And it's really changed things for Kqed, both our relationship with everyone in the Valley. I think people look at Kqed now a little less as this sort of old-fashioned legacy media organization, a little bit more as a fellow or innovator. But also I think it's changed the culture at Kqed, because the Matter, you know, philosophy is based on design thinking from the D School at Stanford and IDEO. And while we do invest financially in each of the companies that come through, the real service that's provided is supporting them for 5 months, providing a place for them to work, providing mentorship. Matter teams come to Kqed to operate in the real world and experiment with real audiences and real journalists with what they're developing. And also Kqed has adopted a lot of the design thinking. We use that approach for our strategic planning now and for our own innovations within Kqed. So we're pretty much accomplishing the two big goals that we wanted to accomplish, which were embedding a culture of innovation at Kqed, being part of the innovation culture of Silicon Valley, and being there to meet entrepreneurs and see the new ideas. We're in fact clients of two of the companies that have come through Matter, because a lot of them really are creating products and services for journalists. The one thing that we did not set out to do with matter, and which we in fact have not done to this point, is produce any kind of a financial return. We knew that if you were getting involved with startups, chances were most of them would fail, or certainly would not produce a Facebook kind of return for KQED, and so far that's been true.
Do you see that changing at all?
Well, who knows?
Who knows?
You know, you don't know. I mean, you could have a company come through that would be enormously successful, but since we didn't go in with that as our goal, and had the goals that I just described, we're really pleased with how it's going.
This next question, Jarl, I think harkens back to something you said very early on, which is most of the world is moving away from fact-based journalism, and you're moving toward it. This question is, does technology allow the public to choose their own version of the news rather than having an unbiased, which is equally subjective, I guess, but an unbiased source from a few reliable outlets? What do you think about that?
Well, there's no monolithic consumer. We're all multidimensional. We all like to experience media in a lot of different ways. But I think what's happened more and more over time, a lot of experts in the field kind of predicted this would happen, and I think it is kind of happening, that there are a handful of really trusted organizations, whether it's nationally or internationally, whether it's a newspaper like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, whether it's locally, regionally, like the reputation that KQED has developed here in Northern California, that we have done nationally at NPR. I don't think most people, there are a lot of things they'll check out because it's interesting, but I don't think they really necessarily trust a lot of those sources as true sources of fact. And I think that as more and more time has gone on, it's become truer and truer.
This is for both of you. What are the profile characteristics of the various NPR and KQED audiences? What's changed, and what are the changes that you see ahead? We talked a little bit, I guess, in connection with the millennials question, but this is much broader about your audiences overall.
You know, what's interesting with KQED's audience, and it's somewhat different than what Jarl's going to talk about nationally, only because of the multimedia aspect. Because we have television and radio and the digital interactive media, you're serving a variety of different audiences. Some people may just come to KQED for television or just for radio, and others may use all of the services. So it's very broad and really reflects a lot of the diversity of the Bay Area. However, it varies from platform to platform. So if I could generalize, I would say our television audience, meaning traditional television, watching television on a schedule, 8 o'clock, the show is on, is probably the oldest part of our audience and the whitest part of our audience, the least diverse. Although there's a large contingent of both Latino and African American viewers on TV. Radio is slightly younger, and probably in online streaming even younger than that, and is sort of a different mix ethnically, and is also a different mix in terms of who we reach. In television, we have over 1 million unduplicated viewers across our television stations every week. On radio, we have about 850,000 listeners each week. So it's a somewhat smaller audience and somewhat different. And then the youngest and most diverse audience we have is online, and that's also the fastest growing.
That makes sense.
And for us, just to add on to what John was saying, it really varies by platform. We can have one show that is on broadcast, on our member stations. The average age of that listener is 54. That same show on a podcast or online is 37. So just the content is exactly the same. The platform is different. The demography of the listener is very, very different. In terms of the changes, we get to, because of where we sit, and there are 1,037 radio stations in the public radio system that we have agreements with. There are a lot of really interesting experiments going on, like some of the things that John is doing here at KQED. And we get to learn a lot of things that are interesting, that are working. And so we've defined diversity as being much broader than ethnic diversity. That's certainly a very important one and something we have to be very mindful of. But there's age diversity, making sure that we have a range of the way the voices sound in age. Regional diversity. It's a very interesting country we live in here, where we're a national service. People are listening to us in Alabama, and they're listening to us in San Francisco, and they're listening to us in New Hampshire. And we need to have, and we don't have, regional voices. I grew up in Philadelphia. I began my career as a disc jockey. I had the horrible Philadelphia accent. I have a couple glasses of wine, it comes back. But I've worked really hard to get rid of it, and we have in broadcast, having done that. We have we need to have more ideological points of view on the air. We need to represent different faiths. We need to be as broad as we can be in terms of presenting who we are if we're going to grow and not just be, a very homogenous audience.
This is sort of an outcome-based question. How concerned are you with being viral when you create fact-based news or stories, especially when you think about the way your commercial counterparts think about that?
Do we like being viral? Is that, or how concerned are we?
How concerned? Does that really play into your editorial judgment about anything that you do?
It doesn't. I think for what we try to do is, hopefully, it doesn't affect our editorial judgment. I hope it does not affect our editorial judgment. That's not what we're about. We think the journalists and the editors make the right decisions about what stories need to be covered. The people that produce and report those need to be great storytellers to make it interesting, but we're not market-driven to the extent where we're saying, this is what they want, so let's give it to them. We don't do that. We cover the stories we need to cover. But if we do our jobs well, and it's a great story, and it's an interesting story, it can be very viral. And we track every day. I get an email that tells me yesterday we had 1.8 million visits to NPR.org. 45% of them were on desktop, 45% of them were on the mobile platform, 10% of them were on tablets, 45% of that were social, and it came from Facebook. And the number 2 is Twitter, and it gets 2%. It's pretty big gap. So we track those things, but it doesn't affect our editorial judgment. We hope that it's viral because we can reach more people.
And I would say the same. We don't set out to be viral, but what we do set out to serve as many people as we can. So I think audience is important. We're not ratings driven like a lot of commercial media because we're not primarily driving for ads, but you don't want to do journalism that nobody knows about. And you do want to provide content that's compelling. So we're delighted when something goes viral, but we don't pick stories because they're going to go viral. The other side of that, though, I would say is that part of reaching the widest possible audience and making sure as many people as possible consume the content is presenting it in a way and telling the story in a way, and perhaps online productizing it, as we say, in a way that it will be accessible and attractive to as many people as possible. So you don't want to go the opposite of viral and just say we're all broccoli, for example. We can take that story and turn it into an ice cream sundae, and it's still good news.
That's quite a trick, actually.
Well, I think that's actually one of the most important things that public radio does. And I really want to add on to that. One of my favorite examples of that is if you listen to Planet Money, one of our shows. They did 2 one-hour shows on the subprime mortgage meltdown. One of the most important stories of our time. It just brought the economy of this country to its knees. It's a hard story to tell. It's a boring story to tell, but an important one. And they told it through very personal terms. They started and they followed one loan, a guy who got a loan, who should not have gotten the loan, knew he shouldn't have gotten the loan, and they tell his story. He goes, I can't believe they gave me the money. And then it goes to the story of the guy that was the mortgage broker. And you follow that loan all the way up through the hedge funds, the various tranches of financing, the CLOs, the CDOs, all these things that make your eyes glaze over. and they made it fascinating. So you can take an important story. I don't know if it's turning broccoli into ice cream, but you can tell an important story and make it riveting and engaging.
This is somewhat related to what you two just said, which is, how are you working to teach, I think teach may be the important word, a short-term tweeting, daily show, watching news audience to listen to long-form journalism, or are you just sort of also trying to figure out Twitter newscasting? There's two questions embedded there, but I think this attention span issue of
What were we talking about?
daily show watching, yeah, there you go.
Well, I actually don't know whether, I think that's sort of conventional wisdom. I don't know that there's really documentation for that. As I said earlier, I assume we're referring to young people, or some people have a short attention span, some people just want something sensational or only watch The Daily Show. But I think a lot of people watch The Daily Show and listen to NPR. And in fact, if they didn't listen to NPR, they probably wouldn't know what The Daily Show was talking about, because you need to kind of be up on the news to get the comedy. So I don't think that that's a huge factor for us. I think that we actually are drawing audiences who do want to listen. And I also think that the pendulum tends to swing. We've watched as there was a period of time where everyone wanted to program their own channel, so to speak. In other words, everyone wanted to select exactly which content they wanted to consume when, and curate and edit their own service rather than just turning on the radio or going to a particular website. Well, that lasted for a while. And now what you hear people say is, oh, I'm smothered under this avalanche of information. Somebody please curate this for me. Somebody tell me what's important. And that's actually the job of journalism organizations like ours. And I think the same thing, if you observe what's happening in new media, has happened in regard to length. There was a period where everything had to be short, and everything actually had to be kind of amateur and short and video. And now we have services emerging like Medium that are devoted to long form online writing. And that's just one of a number of them. So I just think it kind of swings back and forth. And I think we're now in a moment where we're back to trusting a source and curation and editing, and we're also back to interest in more long-form journalism. Certainly, we're seeing that with podcasts.
Yep.
One last question then. If it's been more of an evolution than a revolution over the last 20 years as digital has started to come on stream, what do you think the next 10 years will bring for your organizations in the area of news and information, and what do you think you'll look like in a decade? What should we be expecting from you?
From our standpoint, I think it will be more, again, evolutionary and less revolutionary as we explore a lot of these new platforms and we experiment, we try different things. But I think at the heart, what we do today that works so well is what we did 41 years ago that worked well, which is very good journalism, fact-based journalism, explaining the news, putting it in some context and some framework, and when we're doing it really well, being great storytellers. So the platform may change, but I don't think really the essence of who we are, our secret sauce, is going to change.
And I have to tell you, after 30 years in the Bay Area, I have no idea what it's going to be like 10 years from now because of the way things change and surprise us. But I think, to Jarl's point, at its essence, KQED hasn't changed that much. I think we change in response to what the community needs. So I guess the best I could say is we will still be doing the kind of high quality work that we do now, and we still will be serving the Bay Area. And what KQED will look like is what the Bay Area needs 10 years from now. Because I could have never imagined, frankly, 10 years ago, that we'd have a 160-person newsroom, that it would be necessary for KQED to rise to the occasion and grow our news service in that way. Because I never imagined the newspapers were going to decline as much as they did. So I don't know what will happen 10 years from now, but whatever it is will be there for whatever the Bay Area needs.
Could I have an addendum on this?
Absolutely.
I think what will change is maybe the presentation style. Maybe the content, not so much, but the presentation. If you look back, whether it's radio or television, news, a newscast, say from 1965 or 1970, they look really dated. They look very different in terms of the approach. Very authoritative or, pontificating, if you will. I think the presentation is going to be much more informal. It will still be rigorous in terms of the journalism. It will still be great storytelling. It'll still be fact-based, but I think it will be much more natural and informal and inviting for all sorts of people to listen to. So that would be, I think, if we listen to a radio newscast every decade, going back the last 30, 40 years, they really have evolved. And I think that's going to be the thing that changes the most.
Thanks for getting our series on the future of news off to such a great start tonight. Thank you very, very much. Please join me in thanking Jarl Mohn and John Boland.
Thank you.
Thank you.